We are officially past peak hurricane season for the Atlantic. Taking a look at our past hurricanes and tropical storms, you can see it's been a very quiet season. So I wanted to make this video to kind of break down why we've had such a quiet season and why we should pump the brakes on the statement that hurricane season's completely over. So let's dive right into that. I first wanted to talk about a very key feature in the Atlantic that controls a lot of the dials for more tropical activity and less tropical activity. And it all starts with moisture. Without moisture, you cannot have thunderstorms. Without thunderstorms, you can't have tropical storms. And of course, without tropical storms, you can't have any impactful hurricanes. And I really want to draw this out. This is current conditions in the Atlantic in that brown color. That's where our very dry air is. In that kind of greenish color, a little bit more moist. So I want to first focus on an area called the MDR, or the Main Development Region. This is an area to the west coast of Africa where we see more activity than not in our September kind of range for the season. We have what's called a tropical wave come off the kind of African peninsula, come into the Atlantic, kind of take advantage of the warm waters and start to organize. I want to move this forward kind of in the future so we can see what we're looking in the future and also kind of get a hint of what's been going on. So I first want to draw out your attention to how we have a little bit of moisture in the MDR, but really, I mean, it is very dry. So I'm going to move it forward here a little bit. And it's still very dry. You can see, especially to the north, that ridge of high pressure, that Bermuda high in that kind of north region where we're talking about the MDR. That's very dry, and we've seen this intrude upon the MDR a lot this kind of season here. So this is one kind of factor that is into play, and the big picture here is it's not just one factor, it's multiple factors. So let's move on to another factor that could really be playing a huge part into hindering development here. Another key factor is the strength of these tropical waves that exit the African peninsula here. We're looking at a precipitation map, and in the brown areas we've had a lower than average precipitation for this time of season. In the green we had an above average, and I really want to point out how we have some robust waves in the center of the continent, but as the waves, the tropical waves move westward, they're becoming less strong, they become dying on dry air, and in that brown color you can obviously see we've had less rain and less storm activity just in general. So you have a weaker wave to begin with, and it's moving into a non-favorable condition area that starts to add up more things that are going the way of a less active hurricane season. Now, let's move on to another thing that is really putting a lid on this hurricane season, and that is what's called pressure. Now, in a nutshell, pressure is the amount of air in a specific area and kind of departure from average here. We're looking at departure from average for pressure, and notice those greens and yellows in our main development region just to the west of Africa. And generally speaking, we've had more pressure in a lot of areas like the Gulf, the Caribbean. This extra pressure, think of it as a lid on the convection. So if you put a lid on a pot and you suppress it, so you have the storms that eventually do make it out here. We have had storms, we've had at least some tropical systems that make it out into this region. Number one, now they have to deal with the dry air. And number two, they have to deal with this pressure that is kind of pressing against storm development. And this is a huge factor in general storm development. You have a lower pressure, you have more rising air. With this higher pressure, generally across the entire region, we have general sinking motion. And if you don't know, for storms, they need to rise. If you have lots of sinking motion over this entire region, that gives you another incredible factor into a less active season here. So let's take a more different approach to the actual forecasting here and look at a couple other things before we move on here. So switching gears out of the MDR, that's kind of a general overview of why we've seen less activity there in the main development region west of Africa. That's actually the region we'd be looking at more often than not for our tropical development, especially in September and the early season. Now moving a little bit forward in time, and you might be thinking, well, why haven't we had any tropical systems that are called the close to home, the grown close to home tropical systems? These are the types of systems that don't form all the way out there. They form very close to the United States and can have obviously significant impacts close to the United States, more likely to hit the United States. And at least recently, in the past 2 or so weeks, where we've usually expect an uptick of more homegrown storms, we've had a big thing called wind shear. Wind shear is think of a blow dryer blowing over top of a surface. These storms, they need time to organize. They need to be together. They're like a family. They need storms to be close together and eventually organize together. Now, wind shear is the exact enemy of organization. It is organized wind across the plane of where this storm is trying to form. So if you have a storm trying to form here, out in the Gulf per se, this kind of use this as our first example. Notice those blues and those greens there. We have some pretty significant overall wind shear in that region. And moving it a little bit ahead, this was right now, but moving it ahead, over the next couple of days even, and even to the next week region, wind shear is actually increasing in this region. This is generally because of an area of low pressure, trough of low pressure across this region that is dragging kind of higher elevated winds across the Gulf. And anything that forms, anything that stalls out in this general scope of the Gulf or the Caribbean, you can see that blue color now stretches as far south as southern Mexico. It really is a very unfavorable environment for anything close to home to grow. Now we're talking about kind of more near term. I want to move this out just a little bit more in the future. Looking towards next week, we again still have some decent amount of shear in the region, but actually looking at mid to long range models, we could see more of an opening, which is why I want to give caution. We've had a very quiet season. We're looking at a few factors of why we've had a quiet season overall. But just because the first half of the season, and now we're coming down, at least climatology-wise, in activity, does not mean we're going to have a very quiet overall end of the season. Let's actually take a look at why I believe this and a few other things you might want to know, especially moving forward into our later half of the season here. So a big thing is, of course, we're talking about climatology, what has happened in the past, because we take very good records about where storms form, how strong they are, and the tendencies between seasons, because it obviously teaches us what to look out for each and every next year. First, take a look at our average area where we'd be seeing development of tropical storms for the month of September. I want to point out our MDR, main development region, highlighted in that red color. I mean, we've had in the past lots of storms that form east of the Lesser Antilles, move westward, and sometimes impact the United States, and sometimes move out into the middle of the ocean. We've had a very good example of this type of storm, just only one. Major Hurricane Aaron, which was Category 5, our only hurricane of the season, followed this basically exact track. What we'd be seeing in September, however, the thing we have not been seeing usual September is more activity in this region. It's usually not just a one and done area. And lastly, I want to point out the orange region kind of south of New Orleans, south of Louisiana. That is where we might be seeing those homegrown storms start to originate. But of course, we've had zero kind of impactful storms in the Gulf Coast region there. So let's kind of move on to the future here. We kind of looked at what we have been seeing in the past and what we haven't been seeing. And now let's look at what we may see if things start to switch up in October. So first thing I want to point out is the color difference. As you can generally see from this graphic, we have usually less activity in the month of October because you're usually coming down from the peak. Now, October doesn't have much to compete with September, at least as of standing in the middle portions of September, early middle portions of September. We've really not had a lot of activity. Still a lot of time to go in September, but as we kind of inch towards October, notice how we really lose storm development in the MDR. Favorable forecasts and favorable conditions in that region really change, at least climatology-wise. We start to get more wind shear, start getting less tropical activity off the coast there, and we start seeing more storms that happen and originate close to home. And notice how Florida is in that main region, and we've had many impactful hurricanes and storms come to that general scope in the past 10, 100 years where we've had records. So moving into October, if we have things start to switch back or we have less higher pressure in the region, we might have more impactful hurricanes. Of course, it only takes one. And generally speaking, we have more than one hurricane a year, and we're still kind of expecting that. So just because we've had that early season, actually middle of the season now, we've really reached the middle of the season kind of lull, and it's been very great for everyone overall. Just don't want to let our guard down too early because our actual quickest hitting storms happen in October, and let's see where we need to go from here. We have a few things to look out for, especially tropical activity-wise. generally climatology wise. So let's go to our activity map next. So this is what we'll end off on today, looking at our tropical activity and hurricane activity from 1944 to 2020. Notice that very large peak there. That was yesterday, September 10th, and now we ride that wave downwards into less activity. Now, if you showed what activity would look like for this year, it really would not be much. It would be very low amount of activity on the left side, and on the right side of this peak is just a giant question mark. And looking at a little bit more middle range, longer range, the same things we talked about, dry air, the higher pressure really putting a lid on stuff, and wind shear. Looking into later kind of season, we might have things change. And one thing that really makes me nervous is if we change, what is the potential for a storm? And the potential really can be drawn from one fact here, and that is ocean temperature content. So let's take a look at that. So lastly, looking at ocean temperature content, we have lots of red and orange on your screen. The entire Gulf is in red and orange, Bay of Comanche, the Caribbean. Lots of above average temperatures. And if you don't know, hurricanes and tropical storms, if they can beat all the factors we've just talked about and can really build a storm that can protect itself from wind shear, dry air, this is the defining result. It is how much energy can it tap into. And when there is plentiful energy and there has not been really much disruption from it, obviously we've had not a lot of activity, not a lot of upchurning, the surface is very warm, the deep water is becoming very warm, that is when you become nervous about something that would be close to home. So don't want to panic anyone. There is a decent likelihood we will end the season below average. But again, we've had a very below average season. Just because we've had a very below average season doesn't mean this end will be below average. And of course, you always are nervous for places like the Gulf Coast here. And we have very warm waters. If something does somehow protect itself against the wind shear that's been here for a decent amount of time, it could end up in a very dangerous situation. So with that kind of brief overview of why things have been so quiet in all of the regions and why things don't mean we're going to be quiet for the rest of the season, I would leave you with this. If you enjoyed the video, guys, I really would appreciate a like and a subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Of course, we are getting close to 1,000 followers on YouTube here. You guys are growing the following on YouTube. We've had amazing following on TikTok and Facebook with over 75,000 of you there. Really appreciate you guys. Stay safe and follow for more updates as we will be continuing to cover the tropics. We'll be doing live streams if anything does pick up, especially in the months of October and late September here. So keep an eye out. And lastly, stay weather aware, stay safe, and have a great rest of your night.